Welcome back to the Modern Hippie Podcast. I am joined today by Jon Dean, who is the director of the DMTx program at the University of California in San Diego. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jon.
Yeah, of course. Appreciate the invite.
Yeah, I'm so excited about what you have going on because I've seen programs popping up around the world, but I'm personally located in Southern California, and so one in UC San Diego. I'm curious, when did your program get started?
Cool. Yeah, so we are in the early stages, just launching the DMT division and the Psychedelic Center at UC San Diego. So the center that is launching used to be an initiative called Psychedelics and Health Research Initiative. And so that was sort of all founded on a study that we just finished the first phase of, actually, on psilocybin for phantom limb pain. So in individuals that have had an amputation and experience what can be debilitating pain, they still feel the presence of the missing limb, and then there's pain associated with that. So that was really the precipice for the launching point for the center. And then most recently, we got a gift donation specifically to study continuous infusion, extended state DMT. And then that kind of all came in through my name, and then my mentor is a co-PI on the study, Dr. Fadel Zadon. And so that's really the first DMT study we're going to be conducting. And between those two studies, that's the springboard for the center. And then we have a lot of other things that are in planning and in the works and being launched, but those are the two that have our full focus and attention right now, so to speak.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is all within the past probably 6 months, 8 months for the DMT study. So we're just in the process of working through all of the FDA, DEA, all the applications and sort of oversight committees that need to weigh in on the safety protocols and things of this nature. And yeah, so we're optimistic that we'll be able to start having participants come in for screening and actually be administered. I don't know. So hopefully summer. There's been a little bit of red tape with the state of California specifically has like an additional oversight committee for Schedule 1 research, whether it's in humans or in rodents or animal models. And so that kind of, right now, they're not reviewing any new protocols just because of some laws that were passed that require them to review everything publicly, which they're not able to do. So it wasn't like directed toward them, but it was in a roundabout way. It affected them. So hopefully that is lifted soon, and then they'll be able to review new protocols. But that's kind of one of the big hurdles right now. But yeah, we kind of have everything in place. We just need to work with the agencies over the next couple of months.
Okay, there's so much to unpack in what you just said. So DMT is still a Schedule 1. It's Schedule 1 with the rest of them?
Oh yeah. So yeah,
No
DMT
kidding.
and at a federal level, the classical psychedelics, etc., are in the Schedule 1 category. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I work a lot with psilocybin, but which I know obviously is Schedule 1. It's the craziest classification. And so one of my big passions right now is this DMT extended state infusion that you've gotten going. And I'm passionate about it. And I'm curious for my listeners who don't know what that is or what that means or what the heck we're talking about. How would you describe the DMTx extended state infusion?
Yeah. So in brief, I mean, it is taking the active molecule, active component of ayahuasca, and that's DMT, and studies have been done in the early 90s and even more recently again with just a bolus injection. It's an intravenous infusion of DMT is how most of like the academic studies have been done. Obviously, like, you can inhale it as well. But what that does is it takes the extended sort of ayahuasca experience, and generally the bolus is about the same amount of DMT that's in ayahuasca, but it's condensed into, it's a different form of administration, right? So it's intravenous instead of going through like your stomach and, having to be broken down, et cetera, and distributed through the body. And that is associated just with a much more rapid onset and a much faster resolution or completion of the experience. So extended state, the idea for that came. To my knowledge, one of the first study on that was a 2005 paper that was comparing slow infusions of DMT to ketamine. So it's basically taking that bolus of 20, 25 milligrams, whatever it is, and extending it by slowly infusing it instead of just all at once, like breaking it up for like 1 mg per minute or something like that. There's all sorts of different variations. And so basically with the idea that you're going to extend the experience kind of like ayahuasca, but you're going to smooth it out maybe. And the idea for that kind of was really pushed forward with Rick Strassman and Andrew Gallimore had a paper in, I think, 2016, where they proposed some like pharmacology models of, well, here's how much you would need to infuse, and this is what the brain concentration would be, that would get you to a experience that's like an ayahuasca experience, or like injecting a bolus of it or smoking a bolus of it, but keeping that mental state throughout longer than, a 10, 15 minute peak, and extending it for upwards of 30 minutes to 90 minutes is kind of the paradigms that are going on right now. So it's really just taking, like summarizing that, it's taking a large bolus of DMT, like one would have intravenously infused, like in some of the depression studies that are going on at like Yale, or like even when you smoke it, you inhale it, you're vaporizing it, you're getting a large amount of it. And instead of hitting the body with that all at once, you're carrying it across several minutes and like slowly administering the same dose.
Cool. I'm familiar that Imperial College of London had a very prominent study that just came out doing that. When did that come out? This past summer, I think they released the results of that. And I'm a big fan of Andrew Gallimore's work as well. So I'm curious, you mentioned extending out this state. Will your participants still be hitting that sort of DMT breakthrough, or is it more geared towards those like lower doses of DMT?
Yeah, so right. So we're gonna be doing some studies, kind of like Imperial did, up front, to just kind of understand the dosing and be able. I mean, the safety has been pretty established, but in our own hands, we want to get comfortable with the protocol ourselves and establish the safety. So, I think from our perspective, what isn't really kind of established is whether that bolus is a necessary component of the extended state. So it seems like the health benefits are generally, and the research on this, at least like in academic, like Western science, is compared to like psilocybin LSD, there's a lot less out there on it, obviously. But I think what isn't known with these extended state protocols is we know that breakthrough space, that high psychedelic amount of DMT, seems to be associated with like the changes in mood and like positive health outcomes. So I think that like we're ideally trying to get the participants to that space, because we're particularly interested in health outcomes, obviously, and using these techniques and medicines to help people. Be it depression and trauma, pain. We study pain mostly at UCSD. But whether or not you need that bolus that really is associated with a little bit more of the anxiety and just like complete disembodiment and whatnot, it's not really known, I don't think. So we're gonna try to investigate that idea to see, if there's a smoother way of doing it. And I think that's what the other studies are kind of after as well. So, um, but yeah, so it's a hard question to answer because it's like, I don't know. I mean, I think from what I've been described from people who participated in some of the other studies, the extended state studies, they've described the bolus as being like particularly fragmenting, and then kind of coming to a headspace as the infusion slowed, well, not slow, but as the infusion was administered and maintained, um, they describe it as being much more comfortable and much more navigable and that sort of thing. But whether you need to have that push up front to get to that space, it doesn't seem like you do, but it's not really known.
Interesting. Yeah, I had Daniel McQueen on the podcast from the Center of Medicinal Mindfulness in Boulder, and he was kind of describing it as that like easing in, getting to the waiting room, infusing some more. I described that waiting room experience that I've had so many times personally of like when the medicine ramps up and then I have these alien like goblins who come and they greet me and they have these sharp teeth and they smile. When I finally started talking to them, they smiled at me. But then they let me through to this breakthrough, this whole other realm of being in the medicine. So I've heard that infusion actually can make that transition up easier and make the coming off easier. Is that how you would describe that as well?
Seems like it, yeah. I mean, yeah, what they're describing to you, they have much more experience than I do doing this because we haven't even started yet. But from everybody that I've spoken with, yeah, it seems like that's the idea behind this, and making the experiences be more navigable and less like a rocket, to somewhere, and more easing in to the experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious if there are effects on the nervous system that are known as well from DMT. Like, I'm a big psychonaut. I've done a lot of experimenting, a lot of things I don't recommend. Just to state on the podcast, I don't recommend things that I've tried, like pharmawaska, taking the MAOI first, and then taking the DMT orally later, and that the amount that I took was like 300 milligrams, and it really seemed to like fry my nervous system during a 4-hour experience. And so I'm curious if those things are being looked at in the study as well, to like where that comfort zone is.
Yeah, definitely. Right. So I mean, we'll be monitoring like vitals and the breath rate, heart rate, blood pressure. We'll be looking at like blood markers as well. And just asking people, right? Like, if it is if the dose that's being administered is too much, etc. And we're basing everything like on the prior work that's been done that has established some of the parameters. It seems like there can be some cardiovascular like upticks, but it doesn't seem like it's like 5-MeO or something where it's something that, as long as you're making sure that the people that are participating are otherwise very heart healthy and they can handle the medicine and the experience, then it seems like it's pretty well tolerated with the doses that have been given.
Cool. And so what got you into this? What is your experience with psychedelics? How did they impact your life to want to make this, I'm assuming, what has become the focus of your career?
Yeah. So probably really early in college, like as an undergrad. I didn't really have a major declared or anything like my first year of studies. And I was playing in bands and stuff. So as a musician, I considered maybe briefly, maybe majoring in music or something like that. But yeah, I was never, like doing like jazz guitar or something was not really ultimately what interested me, or wasn't what I was good at anyways. I just kind of wrote songs and messed around with effects pedals. But um, so then around that time, a friend of mine died just kind of like out of nowhere, and yeah, so that just kind of like gave me an existential, like spiritual kind of like shakedown, right? It's like, oh yeah, that's right. Like even people that are 19 years old, there's no rules for like how long we're allowed to be alive. So, um, yeah, that kind of put me face to face with that. But it also, I'd always been interested in science, like in grade school and high school. I took a lot of science courses in high school and particularly enjoyed them. So that kind of reconnected me with that because I got very interested in just death and consciousness and what it all means. And so kind of around the same time, is when cannabis and psychedelics, like, personal experiences that kind of started to shape my interest in pharmacology and neuroscience and like how a molecule can enter your body and really just completely change your perception, your mood, your consciousness, etc. And that really made me want to study that more in depth. And so I started taking psychology courses, and uh, coupled to like my favorite psychology courses always had like the biological component to them. And through that study, I took kind of all the courses I could there, and then eventually found chemistry and loved that, and um, declared a major in chemistry. And then finally got my undergrad. I had a large break because went back to music for several years and just like did the band stuff, and then came back, finished my undergrad, and it was good because I was away from school, academia for like 6-7 years. This is early 2000s. So by the time I came back to finish, psychedelics were starting to be like seriously considered and researched. This is around the time like the Hopkins team started publishing some of their seminal findings with like end of life anxiety and things of this nature. And around the same time when Imperial College and Robin had published one of the first like psilocybin brain imaging studies. So that was great. So when I got back into it, though, what had always really fascinated me about neuroscience and about chemistry was that much like opioids and much like cannabis, so there are these molecules in our bodies that are very similar to cannabis and similar to opioids. And when you take an opioid or you ingest or inhale or whatever a cannabinoid like cannabis, it interacts with these systems, right? So what I was originally in my undergrad, I read that book by Rick Strassman, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and it was like, oh, there's literally a psychedelic molecule in our bodies for some reason, or at least a molecule that can be psychedelic. And that blew my mind. So, and no one was really researching that. So it was like, wow. So over those years of playing music and whatnot, I kind of kept up with all the literature still, like, online and whatnot. And so when I came back, I was like, I really want to find a group that's asking what DMT is doing in our bodies. And there really weren't very many. So after some digging, there was a woman, well, she still is, at the University of Michigan named Jimo Borjigan. And I reached out to her and ended up doing my master's at Michigan specifically to study endogenous DMT, so the body's own DMT. And that was a 1-year program, and then I stayed there to do my PhD, and I continued to do that study on DMT because, generally speaking, like a well designed, controlled study that's going to get published, takes a couple years at least.
Mm.
And then for my PhD, I also did research on anesthetics, and how anesthesia removes consciousness. Like, what are some of the mechanisms? Like, what happens to neurochemistry? What happens to electrophysiology in the brain? How does the brain kind of change when someone comes in and out of an anesthetic? Which there's a lot of overlap with psychedelics, particularly with something like ketamine, which we also researched a little bit. And yeah, so that was my PhD. And then we published a paper during my PhD showing that DMT levels in the rodent brain, at least, and in the mammalian brain, are on par with those of serotonin, obviously a major neurotransmitter. And that was kind of the first study to demonstrate that. So all studies on endogenous DMT up to that point had kind of focused on like peripheral tissues and like post-mortem tissues, or like urine and blood, just trying to like get a concentration in urine and blood. But DMT is so rapidly broken down. So our finding was actually sampling like from brain tissue. So that was
Cool.
sort of a breakthrough for that idea. Yeah, now I'm at UCSD. So for my postdoc, I wanted to get into clinical trials where my work would be more like directly impacting people's, hopefully, well-being, and understanding if and how psychedelics may be able to help people, and trying to be a part of the team that carefully implements them into clinical settings so that people who wouldn't maybe normally be attracted to it can benefit from it in the future.
I think that the work you're doing is so incredibly profound and important to bring this to the masses. I facilitate.
Thanks.
You're welcome. I facilitate psilocybin for people here, and we do things like bring body parts back online after they've had traumatic injuries through connecting that. But I'm also doing a lot of personal research with ketamine and exploring ketamine in combination with other plant medicines, specifically because plant medicines have an intelligence that I'm very curious to pick your brain about, since it sounds like you've done a lot of studying of what happens of the body's consciousness on anesthesia. Like, what is your take around ketamine and how that, like, what happens to our consciousness on ketamine? Because I have a lot of working theories.
Let's say, yeah, from the perspective of our studies, anyways, ketamine is a little different, right? In terms like the classic psychedelics like psilocybin, DMT, LSD are really engaging the serotonin system predominantly. It seems like, I mean, the brain's very complex, so that's kind of a blanket statement, but ketamine is definitely more unique to like glutamatergic processes. And so at Michigan, where I did my PhD, there was he recently passed away, a guy named Ed Domino, and Ed was in his late 90s when he died, but the whole time I was there studying, he was still alive, and he would hang out with us and just had this like really cool like young guy spirit. But he was very instrumental in implementing ketamine into anesthesiology. He's like one of the pioneers for that. And he described in the 70s like talking to patients that were like, yeah, the ketamine, like after I came and had it for surgery, like I found I got some, and when I was using it for my depression, and it really helped. And he in the 70s, he's a doctor. He's like, oh, you don't want to do that, like. But then, right. But he was cool about it, because then he was like, man, I wish I'd like, he's like, always listen to like what people say, right? Like, that's important. Listen to the patients and the participants in your study, et cetera. Because then like obviously the medical community turned their attention to that aspect of ketamine. But anyway, so Ed, was pretty instrumental in that. That's kind of just a side story. But our work, I didn't do much work in with human data in my PhD, which is honestly what kind of drove me. Like the animal research I do was war on my
Mm.
soul, honestly. And that kind of drove me out to UCSD amongst many other reasons. It's a great place. But so our rodent work with ketamine, I didn't really lead those studies. It's just a PhD student and now a doctor also at the time named Michael Brito, but I would help him out with those studies. Ketamine's an interesting one because it at high doses, right, it acts as an anesthetic, and then at lower, like sub-anesthetic doses, it has, whatever you want to call it, dissociative or psychedelic properties. Um, and to my understanding, it's also it's pretty one of the anesthetics that is associated with like experiences, even when people are under. Um, and in the brain, what is unique about it from other anesthetics, at least from a neurochemical perspective, um, is so there's a neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, and it's like an arousal neurotransmitter. It's very at very high levels during wakefulness, and but it's also like an experiential neurotransmitter because during REM sleep it also increases, and during like deep sleep where generally you don't dream, it decreases. Yeah, it's pretty crude, like up down, but what's interesting about ketamine is even as an anesthetic, like in an anesthetic dose, you still get these increases in acetylcholine. So to my knowledge, if I remember, I haven't studied that much these days, but it's one of the few, if not the only, anesthetics that will increase these arousal systems, but at the same time, like you know, detach and anesthetize. Um, and Mike's study compared ketamine to nitrous in rodents. Um, if I remember, like there's some similarities between the two in terms of like what you see in the brain. Like ketamine, and now we're kind of really seeing that all psychedelics really impact gamma. But with
Mhm.
ketamine, like we would see these like really high gamma oscillations, just like you knew when it was coming on because you would get those oscillations. You would see it was like, it's like okay, there it is. It's like impossible to miss. Um, so it kind of it was thought that that might be unique, but I think recent work has kind of showed that that's something that all psychedelics maybe do. Um, but so yeah, what I think your original question was like, I'm just like rambling. What are my thoughts on like how a ketamine experience is a little bit maybe different than some of the other psychedelics? Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is like my own personal experiences with ketamine. And I so rarely get a chance to talk with people who've actually studied it and studied it in comparison to consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
My curiosity really is around consciousness and then what happens to us in our bodies that's allowing for things like I swear my body's much more programmable on ketamine. I can run through affirmations and it changed my energy and change my associations to those affirmations, for instance. I can also, when mixed with another plant medicine, it's like the ketamine becomes a tool that creates this. And let me know if this is getting like too out of the science realm and too woo woo, but I'm super fucking woo woo. So, like, it becomes this portal
You
to your
be
higher
you.
consciousness. This portal to your higher consciousness, right? The ego starts to come offline, and that is that anesthesia, right? Putting you, the more that you take into that K hole realm, into that pure anesthesia realm, that then when mixed with an intelligent medicine like a psilocybin or a DMT or a cannabis, it almost feels like those medicines, their teachings and their lessons become so much more apparent. And for instance, I went on a streak of some ketamine and cannabis and had these really powerful downloads of things to do with my body, to heal things, to release parts of my body that were stuck for I can't even imagine how long. And I know cannabis is a big body worker as well. Um, and then through that process was humming as well, and eventually hummed enough times over the course of 2 hours that triggered DMT release in my brain. So now there's the mix of the DMT, the cannabis, and the ketamine all creating for a very intelligent experience that my body was being programmed with also at the same time. And I think that the ketamine allowed for my body to be more programmable through, for instance, sound and humming than it normally would. So,
Yeah, I mean,
balls in your court.
right. No, it's good to hear about your experiences, and I appreciate you sharing them. Yeah, I mean, a lot of my perspective is like it's pretty rooted in like what's happening like physically, right? That predicts maybe some of these experiences. But I'm also in the camp that what's happening physically isn't like necessarily the experience, right? There's clearly like things going on that science is ultimately, I doubt, is ever going to really get at, but it's a vantage that hopefully provides some insight into what's happening. And in terms of coupling different psychedelics, I think that's kind of starting to happen at the academic level, where people are asking the questions like you're asking, but from the more like clinical scientific perspective of like what's happening in the body, like physically, but also like what is a psychological mechanism or something that like how does that work, that it could maybe like augment or make a medicine better. Because I mean, you have all the time, like people are prescribed, you're sick, you go to the doctor and you're prescribed like 2 different medications, right, that are supposed to work together. So I think that the academic community and the clinical community is starting to be interested in what you're saying, like combining psychedelics for the same thing for like health outcomes. And I don't know of any studies that are like necessarily published on that, but one of the things you might be interested in, you may have already like heard about this. There's work a couple of places at Stanford, I know, and then at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where there's a couple of different things, but a really kind of like hot button question right now in the psychedelic literature is the experience even necessary, for the health outcome, or is this like purely pharmacologic, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's groups that through some pretty intricate and elegant organic chemistry, they're taking like the backbone of psychedelics, and there's like an ibogaine, I believe, derivative that they've just kind of played around with, like some of not played around, they're very wise organic chemists that know what they're doing. I make it sound like they're just like, well, let's try this, but science is still alchemy, in my opinion. But that's gonna help me get grants. But anyhow, and they're coming up with these, like, they're starting to understand like what makes some of these molecules hallucinogenic, and by changing the chemical structure of them through synthesis, they're starting to come up with molecules that maybe have some of the other properties pharmacologically, but they aren't inducing the hallucinations. They haven't quite taken them into human clinical trials yet. Meaning like you can't ask somebody, hey, was that like hallucinatory or whatever you want to call it. Was that psychedelic? Did you have an experience? So they're in rodent models still, where they have assays where there's like this head twitch is like a really popular one, where there's this kind of really subtle like movement that a rodent will have when it's given a molecule that we know is psychedelic. And these molecules some of them will not have that head twitch, and they'll still be there. So they're administering them and saying, well, okay, so does it remove that phenotype in a rodent that we know is associated with psychedelic experience in humans? And does it still have like an antidepressant effect or any anxiety effect? So some groups are starting to put that to the test, like the Stanford group and the Wisconsin group, in humans. And a study that I recently saw some preliminary data for was and co-administration of psilocybin and midazolam, which is like my understanding of it is like it's specific to like blocking like the consolidation of a long-term memory. So people are still
Mm.
having a psychedelic experience on psilocybin, but through some like pretty creative and ingenious protocols designs, they're able to basically say that these people aren't remembering like after the fact like as much of the experience. And then they're starting to ask the questions like, okay, so well, what about health outcomes? Like, is depression, anxiety, whatever, trauma? Do you still get this? And like, do you have to remember that experience? And the early indication, from my perspective, seems, and there's a lot of back and forth on like, there's that you can only get so far with the protocol like that. There's like inherent flaws that people that are doing it are aware of, but the early indications seem like if you block that consolidation of the memory, that you do block some of the effects that are most important or most the effects associated with healing and with health outcomes. I'm in the camp that I believe that the experience is vital, but I'm also a scientist by trade, so I'm willing to be proven wrong. I think that if there are medications that, I think that they're just kind of making super antidepressants, but I think there's a place for that. Like if it can help people, then great. But I think ultimately the experience is very important, and it remains to be seen like what comes from that work. But when you brought up what you brought up, that kind of made me think of that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm in the similar camp of, I think the experience itself reveals so much and allows people to experience what I call the in between. Just the way the energy works in the world, that our receptors are so commonly blocked from perceiving everything around us. And when we take the psychedelics, it opens our frequency up to seeing more of like the radio frequencies in the air, for instance, for seeing more of what's in between the direct radio channels. And I think that's what brings people closer to that sense of love, that sense of oneness, that idea, if they haven't had that or experienced that in a long time, is where a lot of, in my opinion, those antidepressant effects come from, when they start to realize that there's more here to just their existence.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it makes you wonder. I mean, just being in nature, right, on a psychedelic, just it's like, oh yeah, yeah, all right, nature communicating with me, right? I forgot about that.
Yeah, it's like we forgot to go outside and listen to the wind, and we forgot to
Yeah,
interact with the birds, and we forget
right.
going out there and reconnecting. It's like, oh, I'm part of this ecosystem. Even in a city, there's an ecosystem, and there's a flow, and there's all of it. And
Yeah,
so
valid. We shouldn't talk shit on cities, right? Cities can be organic too.
ultimately, they're all a part of the made up construct, right? They're all a part of the
Yeah,
matrix that we find ourselves living in. So they're still made up of vibrations. They're still impacting us and being impacted. And so I'm interested in that your DMTx program, if I understand this correctly, your focus is on how it affects empathy. Is that correct?
that's definitely, yeah. It's that's one of the things we're really, yeah. I mean, that's a health outcome that we're very interested in. Just the outcome in general. I mean, it's so bizarre. Like the NIH, doesn't really want to fund that, but I mean, I think that making people more compassionate is like a pretty serious endeavor that should be. We should put some money into that. So there's this great institute at UCSD called the Institute for Empathy and Compassion, and they funded some of our psilocybin work. So we have been asking that question, but some of the studies that we hope to launch soon are more geared toward understanding kind of the nuances of how psychedelics may be able to increase empathy and compassion. And in study designs that are a little more, instead of just like asking somebody, hey, are you more compassionate or empathic? Like, having it be like a task-based design or something, like for instance, we recently did a study on meditation for empathy and compassion. And like one of the designs that we employed there was having, so in all of our meditation studies, well, a lot of our pain studies in general, we have this the heat probe that heats up the surface of people's skin, and it can feel pretty uncomfortable, and that's sort of like our way of like administering a pain source that in the brain it shows up pretty common across people. So it's like a signal for the brain, but also for psychology too. So, anyways, just to summarize it quickly, in the study we have people we have couples, romantic couples that come in, and the partner will receive the heat on their own arm while their brain is being scanned, and then um, uh, they'll watch while their brain is being scanned. They'll watch their partner get the heat, and then they'll watch a complete stranger while their brain is being scanned get the heat, and and then we just ask them questions about what it was like to experience those different things and see what is going on in the brain. And then there's an intervention of compassion-based mindfulness training for, I think it was 6 weeks or 8 weeks in between, and then they come back and we repeat everything. We are hopefully about to publish that. I think we had some do this, do that, wham reviewer comments, but hopefully that'll be published soon. And I mean, you were saying what you would kind of expect. Like our hypothesis was that the stranger would start to look more like the partner after the training, and then what's going on in the brain. Like, we're kind of zoned in on the same things that we look at in psychedelic studies, like self-other distinction. So implementing more like task-based designs like that in the context of like scanning helps you kind of understand what's happening in the brain a little bit better. But just in general, I mean, all that fancy sciencey stuff aside, yeah, I mean, we want to see if there's a way that we can make people more kind to one another, and not so reactive and tribal and that sort of thing. And it seems like psychedelics are a very good candidate for that. So part of the DMT study will be interested in that outcome. And then just the DMT study too, just the entity phenomenon that is so common with DMT, and what's happening in the visual areas in the brain are particular outcomes that we're going to be zoning in on.
Cool. I love what you pointed out and the unpacking of psychedelics helping people increase their empathy and increase their love and compassion. That is the core essence of my work, and something that I help people stabilize, especially after psychedelic experiences, is like now their heart's open. How do they prevent their heart from closing again? And how do we
That's awesome. Yeah, I read some
that?
of your. Yeah. How long have you been doing that?
For a couple years now. I sort of segued in from, I mean, I used to be a professional wakeboarder and Hollywood stunt woman and producer, and then I moved into massage therapy
yeah, you did say
and
that, yeah.
energy healing. And now I'm in the sort of the psychedelic facilitation, but it's very shamanistic. It's very also mental reprogramming. It's filled with coaching and modeled after my own experience of having navigated a life riddled with depression to a place where now I'm like, okay, it's stabilized. Like, this is universal love. This is, I love you. I love my computer. I love my dog. I love my mom. I love my best friends. I love my cashier at the grocery store. I love everybody exactly the same. And getting people to that state, because I think we so often confuse love. We're taught love for a parent is a certain way. Love for a partner is a certain way. Love for a friend is a certain way. And when we feel flavors in between, it's very confusing for a lot of people. And
Yeah, yeah.
helping them find safety in embracing that, and safety in stabilizing that feeling of love as their normal frequency is just like so important.
So how yeah, I mean, so following up on an experience like that, what are some of your techniques for trying to keep that cultivation and keep that experience held in consciousness, and not let it just kind of fade into the background after a powerful experience on a psychedelic?
I'd say there's multiple tools we use, including meditation, going
Hmm.
in and focusing on the safety and the stability of the grounding, and then going into opening the different dimensions of the heart, but really providing that safety space first to feel comfortable opening the heart again. And then as they do that, also going in on things like humming is my favorite tool right now to stimulate the vagus nerve and downregulate the nervous system so that they get out of that fight or flight response, and then can again look at the world through a compassionate lens and receive the information without being ready to flee or to fight. And then bringing in grace and helping them hold the duality of multiple perspectives, and inviting them, now that they've had these experiences, to look at the world in a different way. And oftentimes I think people aren't aware of different ways they can look at the world until they're presented with them, and then they get the opportunity to challenge their own belief systems and say, is what I was experiencing, was that programmed in me by my family, by my society, by teachers, by friend groups, and is that really what serves me the most? Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's we're definitely interested in that too. That's part of what brought me to UCSD for sure, is the mindfulness community and the research that Fadl has been doing for many years on meditation, and then the psychedelic work that's coming up. I just felt like that was really a very important thing to have in the fabric of launching a psychedelic center like that. To have that mindfulness component inherent to the study, and then potentially developing studies in the future that like you were saying, but from, yeah, again, like from a clinical perspective, where you're coupling mindfulness to psychedelics afterwards, because I mean, that's where I come in, right? Like, is just trying to do the study as rigorously and as scientific as possible, to kind of, it's to work alongside of people that are doing what you're doing, and not to be all like sciencey and elitist about it, but to just take it from another angle, and like hopefully like try to integrate it into whatever wherever that fits with what we're doing, and
Yeah. I love that
kind
though.
of
I
keep
love the
keep
science
everyone moving
angle.
forward. Yeah, yeah, no, it's important, but yeah, it can get a little microscopic sometimes, but
Sure.
thus is the nature of it, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a freak for the science too. It's like once I got
Or
into mindfulness, then it was like, how do you not become obsessed with quantum physics? And once you get into psychedelics, how do you not then become obsessed with physiology and chemistry and all of these things that as a kid I was like, no, 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 business major, how about that? And now in my late 30s, I'm like obsessed with science and obsessed with what the work that you're doing. And curious also, then, you kind of dropped this little gift in one of the last things you said about the entities people are seeing in these other
Mhm.
dimensions. And I think it's so important to acknowledge that psychedelics have this spectrum, especially DMT, from like sort of therapeutic, but it varies all the way into potentially being this really important technology and communication across dimensions with entities, alien races. I'm a believer in all of that. Um, and so I'm curious what your experience has been with that end of the spectrum.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm open to the idea that it that I mean, you have to be. Reality is weird, so I mean, I'm open to the idea that that's a freestanding thing. That you have an experience that's quite literally a communication with an alien. Um, I don't particularly. We're sort of tasked with understanding that with our gift money. From a scientific perspective, I mean, we're going to do the best we can there. Um, but I tend to think that it's, for me, it kind of boils down to like the question of like what is real. You know what I mean? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so even if what that experience ultimately is something that is like generated by the mind. Like what from a scientific argument, what I always kind of go back to is one of the first things you see when you're born is an entity, right? Like you come out of the world and like you see, I don't, who knows what it looks like, right? To your newborn eyes, but you see probably shapes and figures and, a mother, etc. The hospital setting or whatever, it was before the hospital. And so that experience could be really buried in there. So you could see where like something like that would be when you have this like really powerful psychedelic experience where you can kind of like tap into that. And the DMT experience may even be peeling back the layers. Like what we do know from the brain imaging with studies on psychedelics is that they take the brain starts working differently, obviously. But one of the key features is that the networks that normally communicate sort of like within one another will start to that'll break down, and there'll start to be this like between network communication that isn't seen in normal consciousness. So it could be that there's a shift in how the visual system is working, and you're literally like peeling back layers that without a certain cognitive control over the visual input, you're literally like seeing the early visual processes. That's one hypothesis, I guess, if you will. So that's something that by doing the scanning, our study, by doing the fMRI with the DMT, we'll be able to see what's going on like in the visual cortex and correlate it with some of the experiences that are happening, that people are reporting. And I can't get too into the details, but we do have some sort of task-based things that we're gonna be employing in the study that will start to get at some of those questions of is this something that is in your head? Is this something that's like tied to like your ability to be imaginative, or is this something that is potentially like outside of you? And then of course our first wave of or phase is going to be in people that are not like coming for any indication, so it's not going to be somebody that has depression or trauma, but it'll just be people that are experienced with DMT, that know what they're getting into and can safely psychologically navigate the experience. But we will be asking questions, things that are relevant to things like depression and anxiety, etc., to hopefully understand how the medicine works and how the molecule works to potentially alleviate that. One of the people on our team did a large survey-based study about entity experiences with DMT, inhaled DMT, and it's a pretty common theme that those experiences are tied to, in general, positive outcomes in like mood and just like life perspective and just making changes that are for the good. So I don't know if DMT is something is different about it, versus like psilocybin or ketamine, etc. That's kind of, I think, what the field's trying to figure out, like, because they can be very different experiences. But is it just like, it's just such a novel experience that it just completely makes you reconsider everything? Or is there something unique about each one of those experiences that could be beneficial for a different way. And it seems like probably the latter, because things like ibogaine obviously are, seem to be particularly geared toward addiction, and the pharmacology kind of matches that as well, like what's known about how ibogaine works. So yeah, I think it'll end up hopefully being something that could be psychedelic precision medicine for the DMT. Because one of the things about ayahuasca, et cetera, or psilocybin in our studies, once you give it, the next 6 hours are up in the air, right? Who knows what's about to happen? Which surrendering obviously is part of it, but if somebody in a clinical setting, if somebody has a negative reaction with something like DMT in an infusion setting, you could turn off the infusion, and then they'll be back to their psychological baseline within 10 minutes. We also think that from an equitable standpoint, having something that's shorter in the clinic, if moving forward, the insurance companies, et cetera, do start to pick it up. It's expensive to have a team of therapists on hand, a doctor on hand the whole time that someone's having a 6-hour experience. So having something that could potentially be beneficial, but that's shorter, may make it more accessible to people. At least that's the hope. So
I love that. And I would also just love to throw out there that I think even the negative experiences are so important. Like I have learned some of the most from some of my negative experiences. And so I hope in the science
valid.
we find a way to navigate that those are still important, and perhaps there's like thresholds for when someone actually gets pulled out of that versus worked through with them based on who's sitting there with them.
Yeah. I think it's more, from my perspective, like a negative physiological response.
Okay,
because something like extreme nausea, or like heart rate is just like way too high, like something like that. Because it happens from time to time, and with psilocybin, et cetera, in the clinic. There's reports of that, and then you have like rescue medications that you may have to administer. It's just doesn't seem like it's generally like something that's like a great danger, because people are very carefully screened and whatnot. But no, it's a completely valid point, and I'm with you. Like, yeah, that often it takes being really cosmically slapped to make the change, right? So
yeah, I have a theory that's sort of like these energetic frequencies of yourself, that as you shed that layer, like a snake, for instance, shedding its skin, it's like that part gets to come off because you're stepping into a new frequency evolution of yourself. You're stepping into holding more love, holding more happiness, holding more joy, holding more equanimity. And those things are just, it feels like parts of us are dying because what we've always known is no longer with us, which can be that sadness, that depression, that those things.
So. Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, Jon, I have absolutely loved this conversation with you today. Thank you so much for joining me. What's the best way for my listeners to keep up with you?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't do a whole lot on like social media. So I would point them to the UCSD Center for Psychedelic Research website. Yeah, so that's pretty easy to find. I think it's just CPR, but let me just find it. So I'll just like, I mean, you can obviously just say, "Hey, ChatGPT, what's the website?" Let's see.
Sometimes I struggle with that ChatGPT.
Yeah, it's cpr.ucsd.edu. And that'll really have a lot of updates on our end, from like when we'll be recruiting for the DMT study, and upcoming studies that we'll be having that maybe people would be interested in. So yeah, we'll be starting phase 2 of our phantom limb pain psilocybin study in the next couple of months. So things like that is where you can apply to potentially be a participant if you're interested.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and
Yeah.
I look forward to tracking you down for when the DMTx program's ready.
Yeah, no, it won't be hard. Just shoot me an email.
All right. Have a beautiful
Uh,
day.
yeah, take care of yourself. Thank you.